There are nights on live television when the script disappears and something true walks onto the stage instead. And no one in that building was prepared for what walked in that night. Pulling into the parking lot of the syndicated broadcasting studio in Atlanta on the evening of October 14th, the production crew had run the same pre-show checklist they had run 600 times before. Lights calibrated, podiums wiped, audience seated and warmed up by the assistant producer who had been doing it for 9 years and who could read a crowd's temperature within 30 seconds of walking into a room. The competing families, the Osei family from Stone Mountain and the Garrett family from Knoxville, had been through makeup and had been briefed on the rules and were waiting in the green room on opposite ends of a catering table, being politely competitive about the pasta salad. Everything was ordinary. Everything was ready. Steve Harvey had been driven to the studio by his regular driver, a man named Philip, who had been making that drive for 4 years, and who knew, from long practice, when to talk and when to be quiet. That evening, he had been quiet from the moment Steve got in the car. He had asked once, at a red light on Peachtree, if Steve was all right. Steve had said he was fine. Philip had nodded and driven and been quiet the rest of the way, because 4 years is long enough to know what fine means and what it doesn't. What it didn't mean, that evening, was what it said. 3 days before the taping, Steve Harvey had received a phone call from his older sister Sandra, who lived in Cleveland, Ohio, in the house 2 streets over from the house where they had grown up. Sandra was the person who had made him eat his vegetables at 9 years old, and who had read his school reports before their mother saw them, and who had, in the specific language of older sisters everywhere, remained his most honest mirror for 60-plus years. Sandra had called to tell him that their childhood best friend, a man named Robert Earl Bridges, Bobby to everyone who had known him since the 4th grade, since the days of the dead-end street in Glenville, where they had all grown up with nothing much and each other. Bobby had died. Quietly, at home, the way people die when the illness has been going on longer than most people knew. He had been 63 years old. Steve had known Bobby was sick. He had not known Bobby was that sick. Bobby had not wanted people to know. Bobby had done what the men of that neighborhood, of that generation, of that particular school of carrying yourself did. He had managed it privately, told the people who needed to know, and asked them to keep it close. And he had kept showing up, at church, at the barber shop, at his daughter's high school graduation 7 months before he died, sitting in the 3rd row in a suit that was slightly too large because he had lost weight he hadn't mentioned. And he had kept showing up until he couldn't. Steve had not been at the graduation. He had been working. He had meant to call Bobby that week. He had not called Bobby that week. He had meant to call Bobby many weeks across the last year, and had called some of them and not others, and now the accounting of those weeks was a specific kind of wait with no administrative resolution. You cannot go back and make the calls. You can only know that you didn't. He had sat with that knowledge for 3 days before the taping. He had done what he always did: worked, prepared, been present for the things that required his presence. And he had carried the weight the way men who have been carrying weight since Glenville carry weight, which is with a particular practiced invisibility that is not dishonesty, but is also not the truth. He had not told his team. He had not told the producers. He had told Philip in the car, 1 sentence, because Philip had asked, and because 4 years of driving someone teaches you how to ask in a way that makes the true answer possible. Steve had said, "I lost somebody this week." And Philip had said, "I'm sorry." And they had driven the rest of the way in silence that was full of something rather than empty. He had walked into the studio. He had been through makeup. He had stood in the wings listening to the warm-up producer work the audience and had felt, for the first time in a career spanning 3 decades, the weight of the distance between who he was behind the curtain and the man the audience was about to need him to be. He had prayed, briefly, with his head down and his eyes closed, standing alone in the wings. He had asked not to be given ease, but to be given enough. Enough to be present, enough to be useful, enough for the families who had come a long way to be on this stage and who deserved a host who was genuinely there. He had walked out. The audience had risen, as they always rise. The lights had done what the lights do. The Osei family and the Garrett family had come out and taken their places and shaken hands across the center of the stage with the competitive warmth that the show produces reliably in people, regardless of what they walked in carrying. Everything began. He was good. He was professional and warm and funny and exactly what the role required. And anyone watching at home in the first 20 minutes would not have seen a seam. This is the specific excellence of someone who has done something for 30 years. The craft becomes structural, load-bearing, available even when the person inside it is not entirely present. He asked the questions. He read the answers. He walked the stage with the loose-limbed ease that is his signature and that the audience came to see. He was, to every external measure, Steve Harvey hosting Family Feud on an ordinary October evening. The Osei family had a grandmother named Abina, 71, originally from Kumasi, Ghana, in America for 43 years. A woman with a laugh that had been described by her granddaughter during the pre-show interview as the reason our whole family is okay. Abina had an observational precision that came from a lifetime of watching rooms. She had been watching Steve Harvey since he walked out from the wings, and she had seen the seam that everyone else had missed. She had not said anything. She had played the game. She had answered correctly, twice, with the decisive speed of a woman who does not second-guess herself. And she had laughed at Steve's jokes with the full generosity of someone who is genuinely finding things funny while simultaneously holding another awareness in a separate hand. It was between the second and third rounds, during the scoring pause, that Steve made a small error. A routine moment. He misread the number on the board, transposed 2 digits, corrected himself immediately with his usual self-deprecating ease. The audience laughed. He laughed. It was nothing. It was the kind of nothing that happens on live television 6 times a week and means nothing. Abina watched him correct himself. She watched his face in the half-second after the laugh, when the laugh was over and his face was between expressions, in the unguarded fraction of a moment before the next thing was required. She saw what was in that fraction. She stepped slightly forward from the family podium. She did not use the microphone. She spoke across the stage in a voice that was not loud, but was very clear. The voice of a woman who has said important things to rooms that were not ready for them and has done it anyway. She said, "Baby, are you all right?" The studio fell completely silent. Not the whole audience, not at once. It fell silent the way a wave falls, from the people closest to the stage outward, as each row of people heard what had just been said and understood what it meant and stopped making any sound. Steve Harvey stood at the center of the stage. He had been asked some version of this question 10,000 times in his career. The performative check-in, the green room pleasantry, the interviewer's opening. He had answered it 10,000 times without the answer touching anything real. He looked at Abina Osei. She was 71 years old and had been in this country for 43 years, and had raised children and buried a husband of her own, and had a laugh that was the reason her whole family was okay, and she was looking at him across the game show stage with the full, unperforming attention of someone who already knew the answer, and was asking anyway because being asked is sometimes the thing. Steve Harvey opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the floor for a moment. The studio fell completely silent again in the way that happens when a room understands it is watching something that cannot be produced. He looked back up. He looked at Abina. He said, "No, ma'am, not tonight." 3 words after the no. 7 words total. The most honest thing he had said out loud in 3 days. A sound moved through the audience. Not a gasp, not a murmur, something lower and more collective than either. The sound of 300 people receiving something unexpected and shifting to hold it. The producer in the booth did not cut. She said later in the documentary that would be made about this broadcast that she knew in the first second. She said, "You don't cut that. You don't cut that any more than you step in front of a door that's finally opening." Abina nodded. She came out from behind the podium. She walked across the stage. She did not hurry. She was 71 years old in good shoes, and she crossed that stage with the unhurried purpose of a woman who has known exactly where she was going since the moment she stepped forward. She stood in front of Steve Harvey. She was not a tall woman. She came to his shoulder, and she looked up at him and said, in the same clear voice, "Tell me." The studio fell completely silent in a way that was no longer television. It was something older than television. Steve Harvey, a man who has made his living with language, who has been fluent in every register of public speech for 30 years, who can fill any silence with something warm and true and perfectly weighted, stood in front of Abina Osei and was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her about Bobby. He talked for 9 minutes. He stood on his own stage and talked about the dead-end street in Glenville and the 4th grade and the man who had been his friend for 54 years and who had managed his illness privately and who had shown up to his daughter's graduation in a suit that was slightly too large and who had died on a Tuesday and who Steve had meant to call more than he called. He talked about the 3 days he had carried it. He talked about the weeks of calls he hadn't made. He talked once, briefly, about what it is to be the person everyone needs to be fine, to have built a life in which your presence is structural, and your absence would cause things to fail, and to feel, on certain October evenings, the full weight of that architecture pressing down from the inside. He talked the way people talk when they have been not talking for 3 days, and the right person has finally asked. The audience did not move. The Garrett family across the stage, the competing family, 4 siblings and a mother named June who had driven up from Knoxville. June had her hand pressed flat against her collarbone, and her eyes were closed. Her youngest son, early 30s, was looking at the ceiling. Her oldest daughter had reached over and taken her brother's hand without looking at him, the instinctive reaching of siblings who have learned that some moments require contact. The camera found Philip in the back of the studio, the driver, who had been given a seat by a producer who understood that he had earned it. Philip was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and his head slightly bowed, and he was the only person in the room who had known, walking in, what the room was about to learn. 2 camera operators had set their cameras on their mounts. One of them was writing something on his hand with a pen, a phone number, someone's name, something he needed to remember. Later he would not remember writing it. He would find it the next morning getting ready for work. When Steve stopped talking, Abina Osei put one hand on his arm. She did not say anything immediately. She let the talking be finished before anything else began, because she was a woman who understood that finished things deserve a moment before the next thing arrives. Then she said, "Bobby sounds like he was a real one." Steve laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and full, and from somewhere low in his chest. And the audience heard it, and something released in the room, the way pressure releases when a seal is broken. And 300 people laughed with him, and some of them were crying while they laughed, which is not a contradiction, but is in fact one of the few emotional states that is entirely honest. "He was," Steve said. "He really was." But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the camera. He took a breath. He said, "I want to talk to everyone watching at home." His voice was different now, not diminished, clarified. The voice of a man who has put something down and found his hands lighter. "I am going to ask you to do one thing tonight, before you go to sleep. Call Bobby, whatever Bobby's name is for you, the one you've been meaning to call, the one you keep saying you'll call when things slow down. Things will not slow down. Call Bobby tonight." He paused. "I waited," he said. "Don't wait." The studio fell completely silent, in the specific way it falls silent when something has been said that cannot be unsaid and would not be taken back. But Steve wasn't done. He looked at Abina. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said he could. He said, "How did you know?" Abina Osei looked at him for a moment, with the slight patience of a woman answering a question she has been answering in one form or another for 71 years. She said, "Because I have been fine before. I know what it looks like." The audience rose. Not all at once, in sections, starting from the front and moving back, the way a field of grass moves when a wind passes over it. Each person standing in the moment the words reached them and registered. June Garrett, across the stage, stood with them. She crossed the stage, not quickly, deliberately, and stood beside Abina Osei, and the two women looked at each other with the recognition of people who have held their families together from the inside and have never once been thanked in a room this large. June said something to Abina that the microphones did not catch. Abina's face changed in a way that suggested it was accurate. The show did not resume that evening. Not the game. There was no third round, no final bonus, no winner declared. The network later ruled it a no contest, both families receiving the standard appearance fee and something additional that was not disclosed, and that neither family discussed publicly, which itself communicated something about what had happened in that room. 3 months later, the 9-minute clip of Steve Harvey talking about Bobby Bridges on his own stage had been viewed 116 million times, the most watched moment in the show's entire broadcast history. The Call Bobby movement, named for the phrase Steve used on camera, had generated 44 million social media posts in 12 languages within 6 weeks of the broadcast, each one a person naming their Bobby and documenting the call they had made, or the text they had sent, or the visit they had arranged. A mental health organization tracking social connection reported a measurable increase in voluntary outreach among men over 50 in the months following the broadcast, a demographic that is among the most resistant to connection initiatives and the least likely to be moved by traditional campaigns. Bobby Bridges' daughter, Camille, gave one interview. She said her father had watched Steve Harvey's show every week for 11 years. She said he had never missed it. She said she thought he would have found the whole thing a little embarrassing and also, quietly, wonderful. A year after that evening, Steve established the Bobby Bridges Connection Fund in partnership with a national grief and isolation initiative, providing outreach specifically to men over 50 who had experienced significant loss and who had been managing it alone in the way men of certain generations and certain neighborhoods manage things alone, with practiced invisibility, which is not dishonesty but is also not the truth. The fund's first year of operation supported 1,800 men across 22 states. Today, Steve has spoken publicly about that evening exactly 3 times. Each time, he says the same thing about Abina Osei. He says she did the thing that changed the night in 2 words and a question mark. He says she asked, "Are you all right?" The way people used to ask it, before it became a greeting, slowly, with full eye contact, with the weight of someone prepared to actually receive the answer. He says he didn't know what to do with that. He says he had forgotten what it felt like. Abina Osei is 72 now. She still lives in Stone Mountain. Her grandchildren still describe her laugh as the reason the whole family is okay. She has added one practice to her routine since that October evening. Once a week, she calls someone she hasn't spoken to in a while. She does not text. She calls. She asks how they are, slowly, with full attention, prepared to stay on the line for as long as the true answer takes. She says it doesn't take as long as people think. She says most people are ready to tell the truth. They are just waiting for the question to be asked like it means something. The image that would not leave. The still frame captured from the broadcast that ended up in newspapers and on the walls of grief counseling centers and printed on the order of service at Bobby Bridges Memorial, which his daughter held 4 months after he died so that the people who had loved him could gather properly, was not Steve Harvey on his stage. It was Abina Osei walking across it, mid-stride, unhurried, 71 years old in good shoes, crossing toward a man who needed someone to come to him, in a room full of people who had come to watch something else entirely and ended up watching that instead. There are people in every room who know how to ask the real question. They learned it the hard way, by being the person who needed to be asked and wasn't. When they find you, on a stage, at a kitchen table, across a catering spread, in a parking lot at a red light, let them. Say the true thing. Stop performing fine for 1 minute and say where you actually are. The people who love you are already watching. They already know. They are just waiting for you to let the answer be real. If this story stopped you somewhere, share it with one person you've been meaning to call. And subscribe, because every week there is another room, another person, another moment when the truest thing walks in and the whole building changes.